The sense of self persists. It is a familiar structure, a grounding presence within experience. This feeling of a continuous identity provides a framework for action. It facilitates choices, anticipates consequences, and establishes a sense of ownership over actions. This continuity is not immediately questioned. Its validity appears self-evident. The experience of time reinforces this assumption. Memories accumulate, forming a narrative that binds moments together. Each recollection contributes to a sense of being the same individual experiencing different events. These events, though varied, are understood as belonging to a singular, ongoing existence. The impression of a unified subject emerges from this arrangement. Reasoning patterns contribute to the solidification of identity. Consistent modes of thought shape interpretations and expectations. These patterns generate predictable responses to similar situations. The predictable nature of these responses strengthens the feeling of a stable self. The desire for coherence further encourages this process. Discrepancies in behavior are rationalized, inconsistencies are minimized within the framework of a single identity. This assumed continuity generates a specific kind of dissatisfaction. Attachment arises to the perceived self, a desire to maintain its integrity and preserve its characteristics. Fear emerges from the recognition of its potential loss or alteration. The sense of self becomes an object of concern. Efforts are exerted to protect and enhance it, further binding the individual to its continuation. The appearance of stability, however, is deceptive. Examination reveals a process, not a substance. What is perceived as a continuous identity dissolves upon close observation. The underlying reality is a sequence of arising and ceasing, a constant flux of sensations, perceptions, and volitions. These elements do not belong to an enduring self. They simply occur. Narrative memory is a constructed representation. It is a selective ordering of events, shaped by interpretation and filtered through existing biases. Memory is not a faithful record, it is a reconstruction, subject to alteration and distortion. It does not accurately reflect a persistent identity. Social categorization reinforces the illusion of a stable self. Labels and classifications are applied based on observable characteristics and behaviors. These external designations contribute to the feeling of being a defined entity. However, these categories are arbitrary. They are imposed by systems of social organization. They do not correspond to an inherent, unchanging identity. The consistency sought through reasoned thought is itself a product of conditioning. Patterns of thinking are established through repeated exposure to particular stimuli. These patterns create a sense of internal coherence, but this coherence is the result of conditioning, not inherent stability. The appearance of rationality masks a process of habitual response. When the elements composing the perceived self are examined individually, they lack inherent existence. Each sensation, each thought, each feeling arises in dependence upon specific conditions. The moment those conditions cease, the element vanishes. There is no underlying substance that persists through these changes. The illusion of continuity arises from the rapid succession of these impermanent elements. The self is not a thing to be found, but a name given to a process. The feeling of identity fades as its conditional nature is recognized. The foundation of the assumption crumbles into constituent phenomena. The impulse to resist change is often understood as a method of preservation. It appears a logical effort to sustain a state perceived as desirable. This perception arises from a foundational feeling, the desire to maintain ease. Discomfort is inherently undesirable. Therefore, actions intended to avoid it seem sensible. The logic extends. Maintaining a predictable environment safeguards against potential harm. This perceived protection becomes the justification for resistance. This logic appears functional, at least initially. The feeling of control it offers is compelling. Knowing or believing one knows what is to come reduces the potential for surprise, for unexpected difficulties. A predictable sequence of events fosters a sense of security. This security, in turn, reinforces the original impulse, the impulse to resist anything that might disrupt the perceived order. The chain appears self-sustaining. However, this chain relies on a specific condition, the belief that change presents a threat. This belief colors every instance of alteration, every shift in circumstance. Even minor adjustments are interpreted through the lens of potential loss. A slight modification to a familiar routine becomes evidence of an eroding foundation. The emphasis shifts from acknowledging existence to monitoring for deviation. This constant monitoring itself generates discomfort. The discomfort stems not from the change itself, but from the judgment imposed upon it. The judgment assumes a fixed state, a definitive ideal that must be guarded. It assumes that a desirable state is something to be clung to, something inherently fragile and susceptible to dissolution. This assumption dictates a posture of defense, of opposition. The defensive posture, regardless of its initial intent, introduces a new layer of tension. This structure proves unstable when the fundamental premise is examined. Change is not a phenomenon to be resisted, it is the very condition of existence. To assume an unchanging state is to assume a state that never existed. Every perception, every sensation, every relationship is a continuous process of becoming, not a static entity to be protected. To fight against this process is to fight against reality itself. The feeling of control, so central to the initial justification, is revealed as an illusion. The act of resistance does not preserve, it amplifies the discomfort. The perceived threat becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The energy devoted to resisting change becomes the very energy that exacerbates the perceived loss. The very act of clinging generates the instability it seeks to avoid. The desire for security, the fear of the unknown, the association of change with loss, these conditions cease to appear as necessities. They are simply beliefs, provisional interpretations of experience. Their power diminishes when they are recognized not as inherent truths, but as the scaffolding of a constructed position. The scaffolding, once observed, dissolves into the surrounding field. The impulse to resist dissipates as the ground of its creation is removed. The resistance itself simply ceases. The pursuit of security is frequently predicated on the belief that conditions can be rendered permanent. This assumption establishes itself as a foundational element in the organization of experience. It offers a perceived stability, a grounding upon which action can be determined and expectations can be formed. The structure of planning inherently relies on this belief. It necessitates the idea that present conditions will sustain a predictable trajectory. This sense of security generates a feeling of relative ease. When conditions appear consistent, the effort required to navigate existence diminishes. Discomfort arises when this perceived stability is disrupted. Dissatisfaction emerges from the mismatch between anticipated conditions and actual circumstances. The space between expectation and reality becomes a locus of stress. The maintenance of this assumption demands the upholding of certain conditions. The understanding of cause and effect serves as a vital support. The expectation of future consistency provides reinforcement. Causality suggests an order. it implies that actions produce reliably corresponding results, allowing for a degree of control. Future consistency reinforces this order, implying that the present will be echoed in what is to come. These conditions work together to solidify the initial assumption. However, the assumption of permanent conditions is sustained only by the continued belief in these supporting structures. Examining these structures reveals their own conditional nature. The concept of cause and effect itself requires pre-existing conditions to establish the relationship. The expectation of future consistency necessitates a framework within which to project current patterns. Neither operates independently. Causality is not an inherent property of phenomena, but arises from the interplay of contingent elements. Future consistency is not a guarantee, but an extrapolation from a limited set of observations. The conditions that enable the perception of order are themselves dependent on other conditions, which in turn are dependent still. This chain of dependence extends without limit. Each perceived condition is reliant on countless other factors, each subject to change. These factors are not static, they are constantly arising and passing away, influenced by forces both near and distant. The interplay creates a network of interconnectedness, where no element exists as a discrete, unchanging entity. The feeling of stability diminishes as the interconnectedness is considered. The belief in permanent conditions begins to unravel when its own dependence is recognized. The foundations upon which it rests are revealed to be as impermanent as the conditions they purport to describe. The feeling of security, born from the assumption of permanence, dissolves as the impermanence becomes evident. It is not that security is unattainable, the assumption itself is simply not a valid basis for it. The persistence of dissatisfaction arises from the assumption that phenomena possess inherent qualities capable of fulfilling an intrinsic lack. This assumption operates as a constant shaping perception and driving action. It is experienced as a palpable need, a signal indicating something is absent. The feeling is acute, it motivates a reaching outward, a search for something to fill the perceived void. The object of this search is always external. The validity of this assumption is reinforced by the immediate responsiveness of desire. Discomfort arises, and an object appears to offer resolution. A craving forms, directed toward this object, predicated on the expectation that it will alleviate the discomfort. The expectation itself is rooted in the initial assumption, the belief that a quality resides within the object, a quality capable of correcting the perceived deficiency. This cycle perpetuates itself. The discomfort emerges, the craving follows, the object is pursued, and a temporary stillness arrives. Conditions maintain the strength of this assumption. Physical discomfort is one such condition. The sensations are undeniable and intensely persuasive. The availability of desired objects is another. The constant presentation of potential solutions reinforces the belief in their efficacy. Finally, the narrative construction of needs plays a crucial role. Stories are woven around desires, justifying and amplifying the feeling of lack. These narratives create expectations, defining what be present to achieve a state of completion. They solidify the assumption's hold. However, the structure of craving itself is independent of any particular external stimulus. Dissatisfaction does not originate from a deficiency within phenomena, it originates from the craving itself. Examine the process. Discomfort is felt. Craving arises as a response. The object is sought. The discomfort temporarily subsides, but the craving remains, a latent structure always ready to re-engage. It is not the object that produces the discomfort. It is the craving that generates the sensation of need and then interprets any external phenomena as a possible solution. The apparent connection between discomfort and resolution is a conditioned response, not a fundamental truth. When the source of the perceived lack is traced, it is invariably discovered to be the craving itself. The craving is not a reaction to something inherently missing. It is an active force, creating the illusion of absence. The narratives constructed to explain the desire collapse upon this realization. The availability of objects becomes irrelevant. The sensation of discomfort remains a sensation, devoid of inherent significance. The assumption that phenomena possess qualities capable of fulfilling an intrinsic lack unravels under this scrutiny. The impulse to retain arises from a fundamental error. It posits permanence where none exists. This belief manifests as a desire to hold fast to things valued, be they relationships, objects, or sensory experiences. The feeling associated with this action is one of protection. The act appears to safeguard something deemed precious. It seems a natural response to what is considered desirable. This perceived protection fuels the urge to keep things as they are. The assumption functions as a buffer against a perceived threat. The threat is understood as the inevitable alteration or cessation of the valued thing. The logic is simple: if something is held, it remains. If it remains, it is preserved. Preservation equates to continued access and enjoyment. This logic depends on several conditions. Fear of the unknown underpins the desire. A perceived lack of control reinforces the impulse to retain. A belief in one's ability to influence outcomes contributes to the feeling of security. These conditions create a framework where holding is equated with safety. The framework dictates that to relinquish is to invite loss. The error reveals itself upon closer examination. The very act of retaining necessitates a constant expenditure of energy. This energy is directed toward maintaining the status quo. Every effort reinforces the boundaries of what is being held. Simultaneously, the boundaries define what is being excluded. The excluded is understood as undesirable, as something to be avoided. This distinction amplifies the perceived value of what is retained. This system is fragile. It is intrinsically dependent on the ongoing suppression of change. The impermanent nature of all phenomena undermines the entire structure. What is held does not remain. All things are subject to alteration, dissolution, and eventual disappearance. The active attempt to hold only serves to highlight this reality. The more forceful the attempt to retain, the more acutely the impermanence is felt. The boundary that is erected to contain the valued thing becomes a prison. The energy spent in maintaining the boundary is wasted. The desire for permanence is actively contradicted. The attempt to control what cannot be controlled amplifies the feeling of loss. The feeling of protection becomes a source of distress. The perceived safety is an illusion. The logic that underpins retention unravels. It is an assertion against a foundational truth. The impulse to retain collapses into its own inherent contradiction. It ceases to function as a means of protection, and it is only an assertion. The conviction that control guarantees predictability is a persistent structure within experience. It is not a consciously articulated belief, but rather an operational framework shaping perception and action. This framework operates because exertion frequently yields intended results. Efforts directed toward a specific outcome often produce that outcome, reinforcing the belief that focused action will reliably shape circumstances. This is not always the case, but the instances of successful influence are readily remembered and generalized. Anxiety arises from the perceived loss of this control. When outcomes deviate from expectation, distress is inevitable. The anxiety is not solely about the undesired consequence itself, but about the implicit failure of the controlling action. It is a judgment against the action, a reinforcement of the idea that control has been improperly wielded. The discomfort intensifies proportionally to the value placed upon the desired outcome. The more significant the potential loss, the greater the anxiety felt when predictability fails. This expectation of predictability relies upon a fundamental belief in causality. It assumes a direct relationship between action and consequence, a clean chain of cause and effect. This belief is then coupled with the conviction that human intervention can predictably alter the causal chain. The assumption is that by applying the correct pressure at the right point, one can redirect the flow of events toward a specific and desirable destination. The expectation of predictable consequences is therefore integral to maintaining the illusion of control. The continued operation of this structure requires an environment where seemingly predictable patterns are prevalent. Situations where exertion consistently produces intended outcomes strengthen the assumption, making it more resistant to challenge. However, this apparent validity is conditional. The stability of the assumption rests upon the consistent reinforcement it receives. The structure weakens under scrutiny. Repeated experiences of disruption contradict the initial premise. Plans, however carefully crafted, are frequently undermined by unforeseen circumstances. Unexpected events introduce variables that were not accounted for, altering trajectories in ways that defy prediction. The causal chains believed to be under control are revealed to be more complex and less pliable than initially assumed. Actions are not the sole determinants of consequence. This unraveling does not necessarily result in immediate awareness. The framework is deeply ingrained, and the tendency to reconstruct a narrative of control, even after a significant deviation, remains persistent. Efforts are made to identify the point of failure, to pinpoint where the action went wrong. This re-evaluation reinforces the perception that control is attainable, only requiring greater precision or effort. The illusion is simply recalibrated rather than abandoned. The assumption itself does not vanish upon encountering contradiction, it merely diminishes. It becomes increasingly apparent that even the most rigorous planning cannot account for the totality of influences. The conviction that control guarantees predictability begins to dissolve, not with a sudden rupture, but with a gradual erosion. It recedes, revealing the inherent fluidity of existence. One is left observing an unfolding without the expectation of its predetermination. The sense of possessing something solidifies quickly. A thing appears, and the impulse to claim it follows. This claim feels natural, even necessary. The feeling is one of establishment, a small victory against the fluidity of existence. Satisfaction accompanies this establishment. Security settles, however fleetingly, into the heart of the claiming. This sequence occurs repeatedly. It becomes a pattern. The pattern demands reinforcement. The object held is now more than itself. It represents something, a boundary, an achievement, an extension of the self. The self defines itself in relation to the held object. The object confirms the self's boundaries. The system strengthens. Doubt diminishes or is actively suppressed. The feeling of naturalness deepens. This feeling originates from the perceived stability of the object. The object remains, ostensibly unchanged, throughout the cycle of claiming and reinforcement. This stability is illusory. It masks a reality of constant transformation. The object is formed from conditions. These conditions shift and dissolve. The object, therefore, is similarly impermanent. The feeling of satisfaction fades. The security proves unreliable. The boundaries begin to tremble. The perceived stability wavers. The object resists being held permanently. It decays, it breaks, it is lost. The loss evokes a corresponding feeling. This feeling is often described as dissatisfaction. The cycle restarts, seeking to recapture the initial sense of establishment. The cycle continues because the initial claim remains unchallenged. The claim is predicated on the belief that possession confers inherent value. The value is not intrinsic to the object. Value is assigned. Assignment is a process of the mind. The mind generates the feeling of value. The feeling reinforces the claim. The claim reinforces the feeling. The cycle persists. This understanding does not require a rejection of actions. Acquiring and protecting are actions. Actions occur within conditions. The recognition of impermanence does not demand a cessation of activity. The recognition of impermanence clarifies the basis of the action. The basis is not inherent value. The basis is a mental construct. The construct creates the illusion of inherent value. The illusion persists because it is self-sustaining. It relies on its own maintenance. The act of claiming reinforces the claim. The claim reinforces the need to claim. This is a circular dependency. The dependency is not broken through force. It is dissolved through observation. Observation reveals the conditional nature of the claim. Observation reveals the lack of inherent value. The held object is dependent. It is dependent on its constituent elements. It is dependent on external forces. It is dependent on the mind that perceives it. The self that claims the object is similarly dependent. The self is dependent on its sensory inputs. The self is dependent on its conceptual frameworks. The self is dependent on the object it claims. All are interwoven, arising together and passing away together. This recognition loosens the grip. The feeling of ownership diminishes. The object remains, but its significance shifts. It is no longer a confirmation of self. It is simply an object. Its existence is unremarkable. The impulse to claim it subsides. The sense of possessing something solidifies no longer. The pursuit of stability is predicated on consistent striving. This appears logical. Effort demonstrably produces results. Actions create alteration. Circumstances shift, seemingly in response to directed intention. This sequence, striving followed by consequence, is frequently observed. Individuals perceive a direct relationship between action and outcome, and infer stability arises from continued action. The perceived effectiveness of striving encourages its repetition. Repeated action generates a sense of momentum, a belief that progress is cumulative. Each successful effort reinforces the initial assumption. The accumulation of successes suggests a pathway to a state of settled being. This pathway requires ongoing maintenance through further striving. It becomes understood as a process of constant correction and improvement. The maintenance of stability, as envisioned, demands a relentless examination of conditions. Potential obstacles must be identified and neutralized. Inefficiencies must be eliminated. The desired state of stability requires an ongoing assessment of external factors, as well as internal dispositions. This assessment itself necessitates action, furthering the cycle of striving. This process produces suffering. The assumption of stability through striving dictates a constant vigilance, a perpetual scanning for deviations from the intended course. Any disruption, any unexpected event is interpreted as a failure. It is a signal to increase effort, to recommit to the striving. This interpretation generates dissatisfaction. The desired stability remains elusive, consistently postponed by the very actions intended to secure it. The belief that stability can be achieved through striving is dependent upon the perceived linearity of cause and effect. It is sustained by the conviction that effort directly translates into predictable outcomes. It assumes that conditions are amenable to control, that external circumstances can be manipulated to produce a desired result. This is not always the case. Experiences contradict this assumption. Actions generate unforeseen consequences. Efforts produce unintended outcomes. The perceived relationship between striving and stability proves unreliable. What was once understood as a pathway forward becomes a source of frustration. The expectation of control is undermined by the inherent unpredictability of experience. The desire for stability motivates the initial striving. However, the very act of striving generates the conditions that prevent its attainment. The expectation of control requires constant correction. This correction demands further action. This creates a continuous loop of striving and disappointment. The initial motivation, the longing for stability, is therefore perpetuated by the mechanisms designed to achieve it. The cycle operates regardless of the scale of the striving. Whether the effort is directed toward personal improvement, professional advancement, or societal change, the underlying assumption remains the same. It is the belief that stability can be manufactured through intentional action. This belief is unfounded. The recognition of this inherent contradiction dissolves the apparent logic of the process. The association between striving and stability weakens. The impetus to continue striving diminishes. The initial assumption unravels under the weight of its own demonstrable falsity. The expectation of stability, pursued through consistent effort, ceases to be a valid proposition. The experience arises from a foundational assumption. A separate self requires independent protection and preservation. This feeling is pervasive, seemingly inherent to existence. It manifests as a constant vigilance, an assessment of needs and vulnerabilities. Actions are undertaken to secure resources, to establish boundaries, to ensure continued functioning. Dissatisfaction emerges when these efforts are thwarted. Distress follows when perceived threats materialize. The anticipated security fails to materialize, and the consequence is suffering. The logic behind this assumption appears straightforward. Survival, at its most basic level, is dependent on action. Well-being requires an environment conducive to physical and emotional stability. These conditions are typically perceived as reliant on individual efforts to acquire and defend. The need to secure sustenance, shelter, and safety drives behavior. The expectation is that safeguarding these necessities will prevent harm and ensure continuation. This perspective is sustained by several conditions. The experience of separation is primary. A sense of distinctness arises, differentiating I from other. This differentiation is reinforced by the perception of threat, a constant awareness of potential harm. The construction of self-identity adds another layer to the process. Attributes are assigned, narratives are built, and a sense of permanence is ascribed to this separate entity. These narratives serve to solidify the notion of an individual requiring preservation. Examination reveals the conditional nature of this perspective. The perception of separation is a construct, not a fundamental reality. It is a mental formation arising within a field of interconnected phenomena. The perception of threat is similarly dependent, a projection onto the world based on assumptions about scarcity and competition. Self-identity, too, is an ongoing process, a collection of beliefs and experiences constantly shifting and changing. Each element within this framework arises contingent on preceding causes and conditions. The notion of a self needing protection requires a foundation of absolute independence, a severance from the network of cause and effect. However, such severance does not exist. Every element within existence is inextricably linked to all other elements. Resources are derived from shared ecosystems, safety is afforded by the actions of others, and identity is shaped by interactions with the world. The concept of a separate self, functioning in isolation, is logically incoherent within this system. The need for preservation, therefore, dissipates when the assumed basis for that need is rendered untenable. The framework within which it operates lacks substance. The feeling diminishes as the conditions sustaining it lose their apparent validity. The experience dissolves into the underlying field of interdependent arising. A separate, self-requiring protection ceases to be a necessary premise. Existence simply is. The assumption persists that value resides within things. It is an ongoing determination, a constant evaluation of the external world. This determination appears to yield results. The acquisition of something considered desirable does produce a sensation. This sensation is registered as satisfaction, however brief. The feeling is then linked to the object, reinforcing the original assumption. This linkage occurs frequently. Expectations precede acquisition. Expectations shape the perceived value. The expectation of comfort, for example, intensifies the feeling when comfort is achieved. The expectation of advantage strengthens the association of the acquisition with success. These expectations are not innate. They are constructed layer upon layer from prior experiences. The construction benefits from certain conditions. Scarcity is one such condition. The perception of limited availability increases the feeling connected to acquisition. When something is difficult to obtain, the feeling associated with it appears greater. This feeling is then attributed to the thing itself. The association of objects with happiness also serves to strengthen the assumption. Objects are identified as avenues to a desired state. The thing becomes a proxy for the state. Conditioning plays a role as well. Preferences are instilled. These preferences direct attention toward particular objects. These objects are then observed, evaluated, and categorized. The categorization establishes a hierarchy of value. This hierarchy perpetuates the cycle of expectation and acquisition. The hierarchy exists only as a mental construct. Examining this structure reveals a lack of inherent quality. The object does not possess value intrinsically. The sensation registered is a consequence of the expectation, the conditioning, the perceived scarcity. It is not a property of the thing itself. The sensation is a projection. It is a consequence of a subjective evaluation. This projection depends entirely on the evaluative process. Remove the expectation and the sensation diminishes. Remove the conditioning and the preference alters. Remove the perception of scarcity and the perceived value dissipates. The object remains. It simply exists, unaffected by the prior assessment. The connection is broken. The assumption is released. It simply is. The persistence of phenomena appears self-evident. Daily existence unfolds within a predictable sequence. Objects remain, sensations recur, perceptions coalesce into seemingly solid forms. This impression of stability reinforces the assumption that experiential phenomena possess an inherent, fixed nature. It becomes a foundational principle by which understanding is constructed. The human mind instinctively seeks order. This impulse to categorize and define establishes a framework for navigating the world. Recurring patterns of sensation, such as the rise and fall of breath or the cycle of day and night, cultivate a sense of constancy. This repetition creates expectations. The mind anticipates future occurrences based on past experiences. When those expectations are met, satisfaction arises, however transient. When they are unmet, dissatisfaction emerges. The fluctuation between these states contributes to the perception of suffering. Habituation plays a crucial role in maintaining this assumption. Repeated exposure to sensory input reinforces the belief in its enduring quality. A familiar landscape, a repeated sound, a predictable interaction. These contribute to the feeling that what is will continue to be. The desire for predictability further strengthens this conviction. Uncertainty generates unease. Predictability offers a perceived sense of safety and control. This desire motivates the reinforcement of existing frameworks. Sensory perception itself provides an incomplete picture. The senses register only a fraction of the totality of existence. They transmit data filtered through the limitations of biological structure. These limitations, inherent in the process of sensation, further contribute to the illusion of permanence. The mind interprets these limited signals, constructing a model of reality which, by necessity, simplifies and stabilizes. Close observation reveals the fragility of this assumption. Phenomena do not persist as they appear. The landscape changes with the seasons. The sound fades into silence. The interaction concludes. Even that which seems most solid, most enduring, is subject to constant transformation. The cycle of arising and passing away is not an occasional occurrence, but the fundamental condition of all phenomena. Every sensation, every perception, every thought arises from causes and conditions and then ceases to be. This cessation is not a void. It is a transition to another state, another manifestation. To grasp at phenomena as if they were fixed is to ignore this inherent impermanence. It creates an attachment, a clinging to what is inherently transient. This clinging intensifies when faced with change. The loss of what was believed to be permanent generates suffering. The initial assumption, seemingly necessary for comprehension, proves to be the very source of dissatisfaction. The insistence on stability is a projection, a conceptual imposition. It is not an inherent quality of phenomena themselves. Recognizing this does not require alteration of perspective, nor the embrace of any alternative belief. It requires only a direct observation of the ceaseless flow. The structure erected to support this assumption dissolves with observation. The world appears ordered. This order is derived from the imposition of conceptual frameworks. These frameworks provide a readily accessible arrangement of experience. They seem necessary for navigating daily existence. The structures feel self-sufficient, adequate to the task of understanding. Within these structures, distinctions are drawn, boundaries are established, and categories are formed. This process of categorization offers a sense of control. It suggests a degree of predictability. The reliance on conceptual frameworks generates a peculiar satisfaction. It alleviates the initial disorientation of encountering phenomena. Without them, experience seems chaotic, overwhelming. The frameworks provide a foundation, a starting point for interaction. This foundation, however, obscures more than it reveals. It simplifies the complexity inherent in every observation. A mountain, for example, is classified as rock or earth or a geographical feature. Each designation diminishes the particularity of that specific mountain. Dissatisfaction emerges when the limitations of these frameworks become apparent. The effort to grasp something fully through a pre-existing category invariably falls short. A sense of incompleteness persists. The framework fails to contain the essence of what is being considered. This is not a failure of application, it is a failure inherent to the method itself. The attempt to define something by referencing an external classification invariably alters the thing itself. The perception of order is not inherent in the phenomena. It is a product of the mind's own activity. Language reinforces this perception. It is a system of labels, a system of boundaries. The clarity sought through language is, paradoxically, a source of distortion. The desire for a readily understandable explanation encourages the simplification of complex realities. Direct perception, unfiltered by conceptualization, reveals an immediate quality that escapes categorization. This immediacy is routinely bypassed in favor of the framework. The feeling of self-sufficiency is conditional. It depends entirely on the sustained operation of the conceptual framework. The assumption that these frameworks accurately represent reality is itself a construct. It is born from the initial satisfaction derived from their use. It is perpetuated by the ongoing effort to apply them. The more intensely one clings to the feeling of self-sufficiency, the more resistant one becomes to acknowledging its artificiality. The framework is not discarded, it simply loses its persuasive power. The distinctions it proposes appear less substantial. The boundaries it erects seem arbitrary. The categories it establishes dissolve into a field of indistinguishable qualities. The sense of order recedes, not because the world itself is altered, but because the lens through which it is viewed is no longer effective. The initial feeling of disorientation returns, but it is now accompanied by a recognition of its source. The imposition of order was the source of the disorientation. The absence of a framework does not constitute chaos. The sense of immediate response often presents as an unbroken chain. A stimulus arises and action follows. This sequence feels inevitable. It appears to be the necessary condition for navigating circumstance. The feeling solidifies. This is how things are. Dissatisfaction arises when the action produces an undesirable result. Suffering emerges when the result contradicts a desired outcome. The feeling of inevitability then intensifies. This perspective depends upon a tacit assumption. It assumes that the action is an automatic response. It assumes a direct, unmediated connection between stimulus and deed. This assumption is upheld by familiar experience. We observe ourselves acting, often without apparent deliberation. We witness others behaving in ways that appear similarly governed. The perceived immediacy reinforces the idea of a mechanical process. The feeling of automaticity is reinforced by habit. Patterns of thought and action become established through repetition. These patterns bypass conscious consideration. They operate as familiar grooves within the mind. The desire for relief contributes to the persistence of this assumption. When encountering an uncomfortable sensation, an immediate action often seems the most efficient method of alleviation. This reinforces the link between stimulus and action. The perception of threat similarly solidifies the assumption. The perceived need to react swiftly in situations of potential danger encourages automatic responses. However, the assumption begins to destabilize upon closer examination. Tracing the causal sequence requires considering the intervening factors. The initial stimulus does not, by itself, produce the action. It generates a perception. The perception is interpreted, however briefly, within a matrix of prior conditioning. This interpretation gives rise to a mental state. The mental state then motivates the action. Each stage represents a potential point of interruption. The initial perception itself is conditioned by sensory apparatus and past experience. It is not a purely objective phenomenon. The interpretation of the perception is shaped by ingrained beliefs and expectations. These beliefs and expectations are not inherent to the stimulus itself. They are constructs built over time. The mental state is not a direct consequence of the perception. It is influenced by desires, fears, and prejudices. The action emerges from this complex interplay of factors. The assumption of automatic response obscures the intervening processes. It ignores the subtle shifts in mental state that precede action. Recognizing these processes reveals that the connection is not absolute, it is contingent. The perceived immediacy dissolves. A space opens between stimulus and response. The chain, once appearing unbroken, is now revealed to consist of discrete links. The initial sense of inevitability diminishes. This interconnectedness dismantles the illusion of automaticity. The presumption of a foundational essence exerts a persistent influence. It is the tacit agreement upon which perception functions. Objects appear. Experience flows. Both seem to require something to support them, something to be the that endures. This something is assumed to be a core substance, a stable presence. The immediate consequence of this assumption is a sense of solidity. A tree is a tree, distinct and unchanging. A feeling is a feeling, identifiable and persistent. These experiences are categorized, labeled, and held as if they are individually significant. The perceived self is similarly stabilized, a locus of sensation and volition held to be a continuous identity. Dissatisfaction arises when experience contradicts this presumed stability. The tree changes, it grows, it decays, it ceases to be. Feelings pass, morph, and are replaced. The self feels fragmented, inconsistent, and unreliable. The discrepancy between expectation and actuality creates a dissonance, a feeling of lack. This lack is then attributed to an external source, a failure of the foundational essence to fulfill its promise of permanence. This presumption is sustained by a deeply ingrained inclination to order. To perceive chaos is unsettling, to impose structure is to create a semblance of control. Substance provides that structure. It allows for prediction, for categorization, and for the illusion of mastery over the environment. The mind readily constructs this framework even where it does not exist. The limitations of apprehension are crucial to this construction. Direct perception is inherently provisional. It is a momentary registration, a fleeting impression. This ephemerality is immediately interpreted through the lens of the presumed essence. The momentary is transformed into the seemingly permanent. The fluctuating is understood as the manifestation of a stable core. Consider the sensation of color. Light strikes the eye, initiating a series of neurological events. The brain interprets these events as a specific hue. The hue appears as a quality belonging to an object, yet the light itself is impermanent. The interpretation is a construction. The object itself is an aggregation of conditions. There is no inherent color, no enduring substance to which it adheres. The impulse to find an underlying reason generates further reinforcement. The process is self-perpetuating. The presumption is made. The presumption is validated. The presumption then dictates how future experiences are interpreted. This cyclical process strengthens the initial assumption, making it increasingly difficult to question. When the presumption is examined, it is revealed to be contingent. It is a projection of the mind, not a property of reality. The objects we perceive arise dependently, shaped by a vast network of interacting conditions. A tree exists because of soil, sunlight, water, and countless other factors. Remove any of these conditions, and the tree ceases to be. It does not possess an inherent existence independent of these dependencies. Similarly, the feeling arises from a confluence of physical sensations, mental states, and external stimuli. The self is a convenient label for a constantly shifting collection of experiences. There is no foundational essence to be found. The presumption itself dissolves, and the phenomenon ceases to be as it is.